All right. Okay, welcome to the July edition of the IGRI Research Seminars. So good to see you. My name, in case you don't know me, is Uta Brady. I'm a postdoc here at Syracuse University, and I'm also the IGRI lab manager. So if you have any questions related to the IGRI or the website, just feel free to shoot me an email. Before we get started, I have two quick updates on the IGRI. First, we're going to be taking a summer break, so there will not be a research seminar in August, but we'll be back in September. And then second, as many of you probably already know, is IGRI is hosting an online IG training session entitled Institutional Analysis with the Institutional Grammar. And that's going to take place from July 26th through September 10. And the training is structured to provide an asynchronous portion of modules. So basically, it features some modules that introduce you to the concepts, and then that is followed by live sessions that will take place on successive Fridays through September. And that's the place where you can then practice the methods introduced to you on your own data if you so choose. And each live session will be hosted by an expert in a particular methodology. So for example, one Friday, we're gonna, Saba Siddiqui and Christopher Frantz will be leading the workshop, and they will help people code with the Institutional Grammar 2.0. So the link to sign up for the course, if you're interested, or if you know somebody who might be interested, is on the IGRI website. And I'll post a link in the chat as well once I'm done with the intro. So that's all I have as far as updates go. So today we are happy to feature Mahasweta Chakraborti from the University of California, Davis. She's a graduate student and works there with Dr. Seth Fry, and we'll be discussing her very interesting work on extracting institutional statements in open source software development. So let's give a warm welcome to Maha. Maha?
Yeah, so do I share screen now?
Perfect.
So my presentation today is about extracting institutional statements from email conversations between developers and users in open source software communities. So before I go into the details, I would like to start with an overview of institutional grammar and how it features in the bigger scheme of things. So institutions, they are an integral part of them could be repeated and sustained interactions and behaviors between the members. And through this process, they come to an understanding of shared goals and responsibilities and objectives. So towards the end of this process, they eventually reach a functional equilibrium, and that ensures that the institution is sustained without external intervention or any forced commitments. These exchanges eventually give rise to rules, norms, and strategies which play a very significant role in determining the processes and decisions which take place within the institution and in shaping the eventual outcome of the institution. And members come to internalize these processes and these expectations through a learning process within the institution. And institutional statements and their syntactic composition was conceptualized by Crawford et al. Towards fundamental units in understanding institutions and the linguistic representations of the norms, rules, and strategies which play a central role in these. So an introduction to the Apache Incubator program. So the Apache Software Foundation is an umbrella organization which houses multiple open source projects. So Apache not only acts as a mentor, but it also provides a variety of forms of support to the projects it manages, and this includes legal and financial support. To become a part of ASF, it's a very competitive meritocratic process that lasts around 18 months. And projects are at the end evaluated on the basis of the performance, and then it is decided that whether a project has graduated the program or if it is going to be retired and not inducted into Apache. And every participating project is assigned a mentor by Apache, and the responsibility of the mentor is not just to look after the requirements and needs of the projects, but to also act as some sort of a liaison between Apache, the various committees within the Apache, which are meant for governing these projects, and also, like I said, meeting the requirements of the projects and their needs. Apache is a very trusted name in the OSS community, and they make sure that their products and their projects meet a certain standard. And they have in place a set of rules and commitments which need to be adhered to by any project that seeks to become its member or any project that becomes its member. And these have a lot to do in areas like project licensing, branding, really standard product quality, etc. So now I would like to describe how community building is being treated from the perspective of institutional analysis in our study. So open source software development basically comprises of several volunteering contributors. And the process of software development requires that these contributors take up specific roles and execute their responsibilities in the manner expected. And that is that's a very determining factor in the success of an open source project. And like I described, developing and releasing software products require a very specific chronological set of milestones and events, meeting which requires a very bankable sense of understanding and mutual cooperation between members of a software development community. So institutional statements are very significant in this respect, as to understand how communities evolve and build this mutual understanding, and how leadership and governance structures emerge within these communities over time. And such trends are actually very useful indicators of the health and progress of a project and its chances of success within this case, its chance of success within Apache. In fact, we have seen that projects that graduate successfully have very discernible different usage of institutional statements as compared to projects which fail to meet the mark. So in our analysis of institutional statements, our input data was mostly public archives of email conversations between members of Apache projects, emails from users who are using the project, who are using the products from a particular project and have queries, and also communications between Apache and the developers. So the rules, norms, and strategies which we encountered in these projects had to do with several of the milestones of software development and project graduation, namely, say, maintenance and operation of documents, appropriate licensing, preparing a product for release, workflow discussions, website updation. It included instances such as deciding appropriate and approved logos, decisions as to allowing new contributors, and other forms of announcement. So we realized that it was a bit challenging to directly recognize institutional statements in natural conversations, because the components and the the essence of the institutional statement was often dispersed through the email. So it was often several statements making up one institutional statement, or several statements dispersed across a paragraph that constituted one whole institutional statement. So that was one of the logistic challenges we faced in characterizing institutional statements in our context. And this has also been faced faced and described in a paper by Watkins and Westphal, where they were set with the task to extract institutional statements from transcripts of interviews. And they also note that the way we speak doesn't carry institutional statements, and they have to be interpreted from they have to be interpreted with special attention. And the authors then manually set out to extract institutional statements from interview transcripts. So our data comprised 313 emails sampled across projects which were in the Incubator program, and they were hand annotated by experts in mutual consultation. And as previously described, the institutional statements that we found were very specific and were very specifically related to milestones in software development. And the interface which we used for annotation is an open source API called Docano, which is popularly used for tasks such as sentence classification or translation, and to develop hand annotated data sets for such tasks. So the other challenge which we found in annotating institutional statements was these email exchanges were very technical. And even when it came to statements of institutional significance, they were extremely technical in nature. And it often became challenging to decide whether a particular statement had any bearing, any large scale bearing on the community, or it was simply, say, an exchange between developers on a thread on GitHub, where they're trying to fix something or build something. So that requires some domain knowledge of institutions and also software development. And as a result of that, we face some challenges in developing large quantities of high quality annotated emails of institutional statements. So we have some examples of annotations which we build, and how they reflect the nuances that we just discussed in terms of institutional statements in natural conversations and in an OSS context. So on the left, we have an exchange between developers who are facing a resource constraint from Apache. They need more cloud computing resources, but that's not something they are being able to get a hold of. And they are trying to figure out ways to get this resource which they need. So let's look at particular statements. So these are all the institutional statements we found in this exchange. And let us do a deep dive into some of the statements. For example, we could set up a GitHub instance that mirrors from Apache and kicks off runners to do testing. This is a very technical statement. This could be an instruction from one developer to another developer for a very particular, say a very particular patch they're working on, or a very particular instance of version controlling. So, but if we take into account the whole context, we realize that this is a statement which has institutional bearing. This has to do with them deciding why they need more cloud computing resources and how they can set up more cloud computing resources. And this makes it more than just a development exchange between two programmers. Similarly, over here, the first exchange on the left is setting up a roadmap for release for a particular project. And here too, we see that taking the whole context into consideration helps us realize that this is not just about bug fix on a day-to-day ground level context, but bug fix for a major release, which is a defining event for the whole community and pretty much everyone's involved. And also you can see that institutional statements are pretty dispersed across several lines or a whole number of paragraphs. Another example would be the next exchange which I have over here, where this particular line, which says replace high charts by D3, could appear across contexts. It could be an instruction between developers for a very specific task, but over here we also realize that this has something to do with setting up a release roadmap and is applicable to just more than one person in the project and has institutional bearing. The next examples are a few very interesting cases where institutional statements are being presented as questions. So here's an user who is emailing the project asking with some help regarding setup of the product, and the reply says, "Are you following the instructions at this URL?" Which basically means you need to follow the instructions at this URL. So it's much more informal as compared to what you might expect a rule to be, but it's still an institutional statement because this directs an user to a very specific set of documentation that has been made available for the users users and developers of the particular product. Similarly, here's a institutional statement asking presenters at a particular project conference to submit their slides and their materials for everybody's perusal. This is a question, but this is more of implying that you are recommended to do this. You are recommended to submit your slides after the conference. And this is another example where there's a mix of extremely pointed instructions, but they're basically a roadmap and set of rules preparing a project for release. So next, I'll go on to some details as to how we set up our classifier and how it makes use of context to determine whether a particular sentence is relevant to the project or if it's just development instruction or regular exchanges with less of a bearing on the community. By context, we mean here sentences preceding a statement and sentences following a statement. And once we read through this particular context, it helps us to build a better understanding of the implications of the statement. So the backbone of the classifier which we used is a language modeling classifier called BERT. So BERT comes with an upper limit on the number of input tokens it can use. So the way it works is it breaks down words into subwords, and at a given time it can accept only a maximum of 512 such subwords as an input. So we could not possibly pass whole emails to the classifier because that would cause BERT to automatically truncate anything beyond 512 subwords. So what we resorted to doing was selecting moving windows of sentences such that we were not just inputting individual statements, but also information preceding and after the particular statement. And we expected this would be helpful in understanding whether the statement was institutional or not. So once we entered a set of sentences into the classifier, what the classifier did was basically develop representations for all the sentences in a cluster of sentences, and then find a weighted average representation of each sentence on the basis of sentences around it. So it was not just the meaning of one sentence that was being encoded into it, but also the meaning of surrounding sentences around it. So we reserved around 1/8 of our data from the 313 emails. So that was around 40 emails. We reserved 40 emails for testing our classifier. So these are emails the classifier has not seen before. And we reserved the remaining data as training data so that our classifier learns what are positive examples of institutional statements and what are not institutional statements. Because we had a limited number of positive examples, we augmented that data with hand-coded policy statements across different manuals and instructions, which are used by Apache for portalings and projects in the Incubator program. So after training, we tested on this holdout data set of 40 emails. We had an overall accuracy of 96.5%, which is considering all the statements and tasked with classifying whether it was institutional statement or not. And we had an accuracy of around 69% on only institutional statements as to classifying whether an institutional statement was being correctly detected or not. So these are some examples of where our classifier performed as expected and where it missed or missed an institutional statement or falsely detected an institutional statement. For example, here is an email, an automated email from the PMC instructing the projects on submitting a report. And these are the institutional statements we found. Our classifier detects all the institutional statements correctly, but it also detects the meeting, its date and venue as an institutional statement. So for our annotation scheme, we did not consider specific events as institutional statements because they do not carry general descriptions of rules and processes. So this is what was a false classification by our BERT-based model. Similarly, we have another example here where these are the annotated statements, whereas it was able to detect only one of these correctly, whereas the rest it failed to recognize as institutional statements. So in terms of future direction, we have already found some evidence that institutional statements and their usage varies a lot between successful and retired projects. And we hope to conduct further studies down the line as to understand more how specific institutional statements are playing a role or influencing the direction of a project towards its eventual outcome. The other direction that we're looking at is, instead of only detecting institutional statements, if we can go a step further and attempt an automated decomposition of institutional statements into the comprising components for more directed analysis. And one of the other objectives we have in mind is quantifying and clustering institutional statements in terms of the software development processes or milestones that they might correspond to. We believe this could be of much importance and significance in understanding the relationship between institutional statements and the development of OSS communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Maha. All right. Questions, comments? Okay. Nobody has any questions? All right, you're getting a lot of kudos, Maha. So far, no question. Oh, there we go. Dr. Vilema?
Hi, good evening. Thank you for your presentation. And a bit new to the community on institutional grammar. My question is, you said that you look for institutional statements that are also kind of applicable to the community. So somehow you seem to be able to filter when an institutional statement makes sense for a bit beyond the boundaries of the exact email. Can you maybe enlighten us a bit on how you did that, on how you would kind of filter that, because that seems to be the kind of relevance that you're looking for, that it has something, that it somehow influences the behavior of the community. So do you also have filters to distinguish between emails that are purely technical and the ones that you can assume to be of relevant for the wider community? I hope that's a question that makes sense to you.
Just to verify that I got it right. So the question is, what are the criteria we used for deciding whether a statement or a statement in an email had community relevance, or if it was entirely technical, if I'm correct?
Yeah, so that I assume that I got from your presentation that you want to see institutional statements because they kind of make the community work in a way that doesn't need any reinforcement or external intervention. So it's almost a kind of ripple effect that you seem to be interested in. So I was just curious whether you could find them and whether you could filter for that.
So in terms of the question as to how we decided the relevance or institutional relevance of a statement was, like I mentioned, it needed some amount of understanding as to what goes on in such sort of software development. And most of the institutional statements had to do with milestones in the development process. And these are milestones which require all hands on board. And everybody in the community must do their part. Whereas regular development requires a division of tasks between contributors on a very specific level. And once you read more emails and more transactions between email transactions between these contributors, you develop a sense of what's very specific and what's geared towards a milestone and what involves a significant chunk of the community. So I think that's something I mean, when we started, the emails are randomly sampled. We did not know which would have institutional statements. There are emails which don't have a single institutional statement. There are emails which have significant number of institutional statements. It was mostly an understanding of how work is delegated in an institution in a OSS community on a day-to-day basis, and how it happens when some community effort has to be delivered and has effects across the community.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Maha? Charlie?
Hi, everybody. Maha, thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. And in full disclosure, I'm involved in this project, so I know some aspects of it. But Maha, as you stated, it's challenging to pull out institutional statements from email conversations. As like that paper reference, we don't talk in institutional statements, right? Have you considered using your classifier to try to pull out institutional statements from more formal policy documents that might have kind of noise around the specific rules, strategies, or norms? That seems like an easier step. Have you considered doing that?
I mean that's on the cards. We definitely will be doing that shortly. but we did do something close to that. We did include individual coded policy statements, formal policy statements from the different Apache guidelines and cookbooks. So the classifier had some knowledge of what institutional statements formally look like, their components and their semantic representations. And then it also had some knowledge of how they occur in conversations. So the classifier essentially had some knowledge of both. But I think it's a great idea to also extend some amount of training where there are policy statements, formal policy statements surrounded by other context. I think that's definitely a great idea.
Well, just to follow up from what you just described, did you have a sense as to the results? Were they doing as well as your classifier of the email statements, or even better? Or do you know?
I mean, only statement based without any context, is that the baseline against the current classifier?
Sorry, I may not have followed something. No, I was just wondering if you said you ran it against some more formal policy documents, and so did you have a sense as to whether it did as well or better than the results on the emails?
Yes, it really helped a lot. I think it improved the accuracy quite significantly. There were two reasons. One was because it gives the classifier an idea of what institutional statements look like. And secondly, because we were greatly lacking in positive examples. So we had around 337 policy statements, which we incorporated into the classifier, and that really bolstered the performance of the classifier.
Thanks, Maha.
More questions?
Looks like there's one in chat.
Oh, sorry. Okay, Hannah is asking a question. Hannah, do you want me to read it, or do you want to ask the question yourself? Okay. So Hannah is asking a more general question, Maha. What do you want to learn from this? What kind of knowledge results do you expect?
I mean, currently we are looking at the usage of institutional statements across projects which graduate the program and projects which fail to graduate, and also how the usage of institutional statements changes over time, and if that's an indicator of how these projects fare. So that's what we're looking at right now.
And what kind of knowledge or results do you expect?
We have seen some differences between how the two successful and not so successful projects use their institutional statements, and work is underway to further interpret the results and see how they describe behavior of these two types of projects.
Cool. Thank you on behalf of Hannah, who's been having technical difficulties. Any more questions? It's summer. Everybody
I have my hand up.
Oh, where? There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, didn't
Hi.
see you. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. Sorry, I can't turn to my video. My internet's too weak here. And as full disclosure, just like Charlie, I'm involved with this project. But I was just wanting to ask Maha, right now, Apache, all the conversations have to be on email. Some are using Slack. And I just, we're finding that that's happening some. So I wondered if you could just think a bit about, like, what if communication goes to Slack? What do you think that the changes would be that we would need to think about? And maybe Seth is going to have to jump in on this one too, because I'm just kind of curious if the communication shifts to other social media, how much is that going to complicate things for us pulling out institutional statements?
So I think here's how I would describe it. So I don't think, I mean, also I'm still working on that, but from my readings, my impression is the change of platform should not have much of a bearing in the conversational corpus between project members, because they still talk about similar things. The change might happen when the context changes. For example, if we go from an OSS context to an entirely different domain, or even between organizations, because they work differently. That's the case where the context might change. There has been observed differences in context between different email folders, even in the archives. For example, the developer communication folders, they mostly have they have a lot of conversational exchanges between developers. But if we look at the commit folders, which mostly contain data from commits and other sort of version control activities and data code archiving activities from developers, over there the conversations are much more technical. So I think some prior knowledge helps as to what is the nature of the conversation. Are they talking about the same things on Slack as they do in the sort of emails we have? Are they still talking only development related nitty-gritties, or beyond that? I think that sort of information really helps as to whether our classifier will be relevant or not. Apart from that, there are ways to adapt a classifier, even based on changes in corpus, based on changes in context, and we are looking into ways to deal with that.
Great, thanks, Maha.
I can back up a little bit. I was a skeptic that we would have a lot of transfer knowledge. I was quite skeptical that training, on one set of policies would give us a good classifier on a different set of policies. I didn't think the algorithm would be able to generalize. To my surprise, we've seen an impressive amount of success at generalizing, even though I thought it was futile and not even worth trying. Maha really went ahead with it, training on written policy statements, and dramatically improved the classifier on email exchange. So I definitely agree with the assessment that the same people with the same vocabulary changing platforms, we should have surprisingly high quality generalization. Now, switching to very different things that are being governed, that are governing different things and using different vocabularies, we're going to find out how strong transfer is there. But if it's good, then we're in a very nice position. The difficult position to be in would be if we have to do a bunch of hand coding in every domain that we want to go computational on. The great news would be if we can just use an out-of-the-box classifier that's already been trained on many domains and already has been proven to be able to generalize into new ones. So we'll see if that's where we end up. But there's plenty of reason to think that despite all of our intuitions about the importance of context and so on, that it's magically going to work.
Maybe Ute, I should just say this point.
I was just reading it. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I just basically wanted to say that, here, I'll turn on my video, but I just personally see this as really important for IGRI network work, because, if you imagine if you have, this is probably obvious to the entire, everybody here, but imagine if you have digital documents of policy statements with other noise in those documents that aren't institutional statements. The first step would be what Maha and Seth have been trying to do, pull out those institutional statements. And then step two would be using a method like Doug Rice, and I know Christopher Frantz and Bartek, others have been working on this too, trying to break out those institutional statements into the Abdico database structure or the IG 2.0 database structure. And it's just, it's a hard problem, but can you imagine if we can do this rather than manually coding IG? What an important contribution that'll be to our knowledge of how our world works. So I get really excited about, what you're trying to do, and it's a hard problem, but I just wanted to, make that point. Looks like there's a hand up.
Yeah. Thanks, Charlie. Curtis?
Hey, so I unfortunately was late and you may have covered this, but I'm wondering, Maha, if you have any sense what the breakdown of features that the classifier is using. Have you investigated this at all? Are they more semantic? Are they more syntactic? Do you have any sense about how the classifier is doing its classification?
Okay, so yeah, that's an interesting question. So right now we are extracting only semantic features, and it's mostly semantic features encoded into a fixed length vector representation. So there has been some studies that the way BERT encodes these semantic representations reflect some syntactic understanding, but study is still underway. So we would like to think that this is mostly a semantic representation. And we also hope to take up further work down the line in towards more of syntactic understanding.
Okay. Nothing in chat, no more. I actually have a question for you, Maha, if I may. And I may have missed it in your presentation, so let me know if that's the case. But when you're talking about institutional statements, are you talking about regulative, or also are you also looking at constitutive statements? Because I would imagine some of those statements are not always regulative. Some of them actually pertain to the system, what can and cannot be done within the system parameters.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I might drop on some of the examples I showed. For example, the roadmaps for release, there are constitutive examples. There are regulative examples, but the interesting thing is Apache puts regulative rules very politely, so they might not stand out. But we have included both regulative and constitutive examples, which describe process and rules pertaining to these communities.
Did you find a connection? Did you find that there was, so in my own coding, I found that the constitutive rules were generally about 1/3 of all the regulative statements, of all the statements, and then the rest were regulative. So if you take 100%, 1/3 was basically constitutive and the rest were regulative. Did you find that kind of a pattern, or is that not necessarily something you looked at?
We have mostly looked at institutional statements as a level so far instead of regulative versus constitutive. So that's something that's also on the cards and it's pretty important.
Okay, thank you. Is anybody else curious about anything or want feedback, questions? No? Well, I suppose we could end early and call it a summer break. No? Okay. Thank you, Maha, for your very interesting presentation. And thank you, everyone, for engaging and participating in the forum. Really appreciate it. So this concludes today's seminar, kind of early, but enjoy the summer break, and we'll see you back in September, on September 7th, for our next research seminar featuring Silvana Peralta from the Inter-American Development Bank, and she'll be talking about adapting the grammar of institutions in order to look at constitutive statements in the context of forest laws in Paraguay. So have a great summer. See you in September. Thank you, Maha. Great presentation. Thanks, Seth.